It is such an incredible pleasure to welcome you back to day 3 of Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return at 20, a virtual gathering. I am Andrea Davis, Associate Professor of Black Cultures of the Americas in the Department of Humanities at York University in Toronto, and I have been given the wonderful task of moderating today's opening panel. Keguro Macharya remarked in his offering yesterday that this gathering is itself a constellation of maps. Map understood the way Brand concludes in her book as, quote, a life of conversations after a forgotten list of irretrievable selves, end of quote. These maps, Keguro adds, quote, lead to and around and from and within this gathering. It is a map that tracks across panels, all of us bringing our tangled frequencies. It is a map made up of YouTube videos featuring the songs and sounds and whispers of multiple voices gathered by Dionne Brand's map into a chorus: memory, history, direction, waywardness, response, repose. It is a map of quotations posted across social media, of a rainbow of colors used to underline and highlight and squiggle and annotate the map that gathers us here, end quote. Thank you, Keguro, so much for that. In these conversations, these tangled frequencies, each scholar, each artist, each of you who have set aside time to hold space with us, excavate this list of our irretrievable selves to create a new opening into Black life in all its complexity, rhythms, beauty, and wonder. I am full and grateful. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. We have arranged closed captioning for this webinar. If you would benefit from closed captioning, please bring your mouse to the bottom of the screen and select Live Transcript. This event will also be streamed live on YouTube, and that link is being made available in the chat. We encourage you to use the hashtag MapAt20 to share your reactions and comments on social media. We begin today with marking the violent histories of where we are, with making note of and reminding us of the ongoing conflicts and contradictions of this land, this water, this air. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee. The meeting place of Toronto remains the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us, those native to this land, Indigenous peoples from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who have come here by force or otherwise as a result of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, and ongoing wars. When we enter any room, even or especially virtual rooms like these, we must bring these histories into view. This acknowledgement is particular to Toronto, the location of York University, and the host of A Map to the Door of No Return at 20. But we are meeting together virtually from countries around the world, each with its own histories of conquest, white settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and ongoing wars. And we must also acknowledge and bring those histories and presence into view. It is with this knowledge that we enter and meet here today in the hopes of making a different world. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to each of today's panelists. I will introduce them in turn as they are going to speak. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker. Josh Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Howard University and editor of a Gathering Together literary journal. He's the author of We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of the Howard University Student Protest of 1989, published in 2019, and Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, published in 2021. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, musics, and foodways, as well as critical university studies and interdisciplinarity. The title of his offering is No Spaces and Returns. Josh, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's actually very much an honor to be here. When I got the invitation, I wasn't sure why, why me, but I thank you, and hopefully we can together discover why. Thank you, Christina, for thinking of me. And as Andrea said, the title of my offering is No Spaces and Returns. The maps of the modern world created no spaces of freedom. Blackness was its warrant. Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return is meditation and reflection of the meaning of these conditions. As meditation, it sings to us in a blue note that worries us, that lingers in the unsettled. It writes Black life as unsettled by the modern world and its maps. But Black life also unsettles the practices of cartography. Indeed, the maps that we have are political maps that are generated out of colonial desires. So too is philosophy. So too is religion. So too are all the academic disciplines. Black life disrupts them, which is why they insist on us not living. We might imagine different sorts of maps, think from different sorts of places. This to me is Dionne Brand. Dionne Brand be worrying. And we be worrying, but not all worry is despair. To worry is also to practice unsettling, the unsettling of nation, the unsettling of belonging. Some of us Black folk never wanted to belong anyway. Who could want nation when nation has meant enslavement? Who could want the state when the normative citizen subject has meant whiteness, has meant dispossession, has meant war? Who really wants nation at all? The claims of and on nation, on hyphenated coexistence are a kind of class desire, but class read through a sort of erasure of the very identity that is supposed to secure that coexistence. Nation is really just whiteness persevering. The settler colonial nations make this obvious, but that desire is refracted everywhere one cares to look. Dionne Brand looks in the obvious places like Canada and South Africa and the United States, but she also looks in Grenada. What do we make of the violation of democratic centralism as a pretext for the disruption of revolution that is still undone by an imperialist order, a United States led by people who are scared because of Grenada's location on a map? Cartography is always about control and order and settlement. Yet, why must whiteness persevere in the face of Black autonomy, no matter how fraught or no matter how incomplete? This autonomy is not always nation or nationalistic. It's not always a project of belonging. Sometimes Blackness really just means we will not accept the terms that exclude, that make freedom a reversal. I am tired of everything being about a nation. This kind or that kind, this version of empire or that version of empire, this historical example and that historical example. Belonging does not interest me, Brand writes. I feel that. As someone who is an intellectual and is thus supposed to desire in all the ways that Brand writes about desire, as someone who is supposed to want all the things they offer us and to be desired by the very structures we oppose, I feel that. Nation does not interest me. Representation does not interest me. Legal standing does not interest me. Even democracy does not interest me. The world ain't safe for democracy. It's unsafe because of the conceit of democracy. The universities that uphold that conceit do not interest me. Disciplines do not interest me. Recognition does not interest me. Awards do not interest me. All the things I am supposed to be interested in as a scholar or intellectual do not interest me. None of that shit is interesting, but they are interests. That is interest of the state, of capital, of order. They are interested in your interest. So I refuse, like Brand, to be interested. I am less interested as much as I am moved by a sense of us, a non-disciplinary, non-policed sense of us that evades the traps of political subjectivity, even as the interests of the state want to obliterate us. In the face of the state, which wants us to belong as abject, as contained, as the obverse of who they think themselves to be, we practice survival against their plans. We stitch it together, we cobble it together, we gather it together, we build it. We worry. Not as a form of fear or concern, but we worry, as in we tarry, we linger, like Aretha Franklin's Precious Memories. Worrying the notes is what the blues do. Sometimes we gotta worry categories too. Like Ambrose Akinmusire be worrying on trumpet. The form is music, but the meaning is life force. Like how Esperanza Spalding been trying to show us. Autonomy was about life, not a utopian project or a shining city on the hill, but a vision of life. Not a spatial arrangement or a creation story, but a way of working out and practicing how to be alive and how to relate. I think Dionne Brand is interested in how we actually live and not in how categories we are given are supposed to make sense out of our lives. As Brand writes, quote, "This spirit's only conveyance is each morning breath, departures of any kind, tapers, sheets of anything, paper, cloth, rain, ice, spittle, glass. It likes blue and fireflies," end quote. Blue and fireflies. The blues is also fire, black fire. Marooned we are in the blues, in the flight of fireflies, in the dancing flames of fire. Marooned we are in the places that unpeople us, that unplace us. Marooned we are, and yet unraveled. Not only bereft, not only forgotten, not only deaf, but also not citizen, also not subject, and also don't want to be. So the ruddier for the maroon in the diaspora is probably a reminder that life is not reducible to a political category that is legible to us now. We do not have to fit, and we don't. And as Brand recalls in the conversation in MAP, so what? As Miles Davis recalled, so what? The marooned are also maroons. Maroon societies, the Palinkis, the Quilombos, the outliers are not reducible to nation. I do not care what the new historians are saying. Their archival fealties cannot capture what our ancestors were actually doing. That they were worrying this category of nation. We are bereft of Western subjectivity, but this is no acceptance of inferiority. It is a refusal of their terms of knowing. Because we are not bereft of what we really are, no matter that we cannot name it in their language, no matter that we cannot build a large enough category to encompass what it is, we still have it. I think of maps and territories, and I think of Dionne Brand. I think of her grandfather and her grandmother, the ways they tried to reckon with place, with belonging, with privacy, with holding on to something they might have felt like was slipping. And her uncle and his facility with language, perhaps it could clarify what could not be known, perhaps it couldn't. The ragged copy of the Black Napoleon. I think of what holds these strands of relation together. And it is not a common political project. It is a common way of being, of living. They are surrounded by the sea, on land taken, on land owned, but they refuse something about the circumstances that got them to where they are. Nation does not explain it. Neither do anthropological readings of their culture. The blues escape Western meaning. What is anthropology to the children who want to know if Dionne is from town? What is history to them, to the world they desire, to their play? What is their relation? I think of Maps and Territories, and I think of Sylvia Wynter. I think of sitting down together to talk a little about culture so we can worry about all that we mistook, about all we lost by seeking to belong. The blues is arrangement against the frame of the composition. For every time they think they know us, we unsettle it because they don't really know. And some of us know that we can never afford to let them know. Some of us know why they are interested in knowing. I think of Maps and Territories as routes of escape. I also think of returns as escape. We can escape those categories of meaning that are called disciplines, that are called literature, that are called poetry, that are called theory, that are called language, that are called thought, that call us out of our names, that make us forget our names, that make forgetting necessary to manufacture our consent. We can escape a sort of capture, perhaps, if we return to the blues. Each line is a return, but it's not closure. Our life force moves round and round. We be like blue and fireflies. I think of Winter and I think of Brand, but I think also of Miriam Makeba and Bessie and Billy and John Lee and Stagger Lee and Liz and Gregory, who remind us that the blues are the residue of not forgetting. We still worrying. And it is with the blues that we create rushes for any life worth living. It ain't gotta be rigorous. It ain't gotta be legislated. It ain't gotta be order. And I do not care that I as a scholar cannot see it, that the negation of Blackness makes it almost impossible to see life, that the archives make it almost impossible to see life, that the political subjectivities that currently exist make it almost impossible to see life, that the Western radicalisms that are supposed to save all of us make it almost impossible to see our lives. I don't care, because I have my blues. I have a way of unsettling all those categories. We have a way of unsettling those categories. Just listen closely. You will find life all around you. You will find survival all around you. You will find us living all around you. Freedom is in the living. The marooned are living. And to be real, sometimes we intellectuals need to just live too. Thank you.
Josh, thank you so much for that provocative and necessary refusal of nation and its deceits. I think you've definitely answered the question of why you're here. Thank you for accepting Christina's invitation. I'm now going to introduce Ronald Cummings. Ronald Cummings is Associate Professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. His work focuses on Caribbean literature and Black diaspora studies. He has co-edited 2 critical volumes, The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism, and the Sir George Williams Occupation with Nalini Mohabir, and Caribbean Literature in Transition, 1970 to 2020 with Alison Donnell. He's also the editor of Make the World New, the poetry of Lillian Allen. The title of his offering follows from Josh's On Capture Land. Thank you so much, Ron, for being with us today.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks for the invitation. I will be, while I'm speaking, a video will be playing alongside my talk. It's the video of the film On Capture Land, which I'll be, the film Capture Land, which I'll be talking about. So I'll begin. My title is On Capture Land, Part 1. I begin with 2 epigraphs. The first, from a map to the door of no return. It is not enough just to have a map, we need a cognitive schema. What if the cognitive schema is captivity? Epigraph 2, from Chronics. Some of the place where you want to live sweet, a thiefing land, there's no title for it. And some of the place where you want to live nice, a thief them thief it in the name of Christ. Carry we go home and make we settle and cease. Mana Rasta Man, and Rasta no live pan of capture land. To think about maps is to think about the tension between capture and land. The colonial enterprise of which map making and geography were only a part was built on practices of occupying land through capture and militarization. At the same time, map making was also an attempt to capture land through the charting of the contours of the terrain, the drawing of the boundaries of territories, the making of borders, and the tracing of the limits of shorelines and the trajectory of coastlines. When Chronix sings Mana Rasta Man and Rasta no live pan no capture land, it's an attempt to remember the history of conquest and settler colonialism, as well as simultaneously a rejection of a particular emplacement within Babylon. Yet the ambiguity of the concept of capture land as a way of intervening in discourses and contexts of settler colonialism is that for those living in the wake of the plantation, to use Deborah Thomas's phrase, or what we might call, following Ronald Walcott, as living in the long emancipation, for those, the practice of making plot and provision grounds and of capturing land within colonial geographies potentially subverted and challenged colonial modes of possession enacted through papers and titles. This was the ground on which free villages were enacted, and I'm using the verb form enacted here to think about the making of free villages. This is the ground that historically marks the tension and the boundary line between plot and plantation as ways of occupying colonial geographies. While not offering us a way out of the colonial conundrum of property, and here, of course, I'm referencing Ronaldo Walcott's work on property, on the need to abolish property. This served as a challenge to the landed ownership of the colonial gentry. For the descendants of the enslaved, this wasn't ownership, but making life in the space of liminal possibility between possession and dispossession. So when Chronix sings about capture land, it is also an attempt to find another term, another grammar, another register to talk about a geography of unbelonging within the long experience of colonialism. This geography of unbelonging is expressed in Dionne Brand's writing of the Black body in diaspora. My body feels always in the middle of a journey. It is always alert. It does not doze off or sleep easy. Part 2. From Kai Miller's The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion. And I smiled on Wednesday when Emily mentioned Miller's Cartographer as a kind of sequel to A Map to the Door of No Return, because I also read that book in the same way. So from Miller's poem. But the cartographer, 'tis true, dismisses too easily the Rastaman's view, has never read his provocative dissertation, Capture Land as Identity Reclamation in Post-Colonial Jamaica. Hell, the cartographer did not even know the Rastaman had a PhD from Glasgow, no less, in which, among other things, he cites Sylvia Wynter's most cryptic essay on how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in the unbearable wrongness of being. One of the things that A Map to the Door of No Return teaches us is to think intertextually and relationally. And I would add this to Tiana's rich thinking yesterday about the methodology of notes in Brand's text. In this regard, the book is a methodological template and tour de force. To inhabit Brand's text is to see, hear, and feel a practice of thinking with each other. Here, Brand traces a cognitive terrain that tracks relations and resonances through and between figures such as Césaire, Wilson Harris, Toni Morrison, Marlene Green, V.S. Naipaul, Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and others. To read through MAP is to engage in an expansive literary cognitive terrain as part of the process of thinking about Black diaspora possibility as relational creative force. This intertextual approach guides my reflections today in thinking about MAP alongside Chronix's song and Nabil Elderkin's short film, Capture Land. And of course, Elderkin's film is also responding to Chronix's song, as well as Kai Miller's Cartographer and Sylvia Wynter's astute reflections on what it means to mistake the map for the territory. And these all point to a complex network of signifiers for understanding our relation in Babylon and the territoriality of colonial power. While A Map to the Door of No Return is about maps, there are no images included in the text. By contrast, at the end of Nabil Elderkin's film, as you will see when we get to the end of the film that's currently being showed, we are left with a map. The map remains as evidence, perhaps state evidence, and a visual representation of the moment of flight and the journey that the film narrates. Elderkin's short film tells the story of Taki and a group of men living on the coastline of Jamaica who embark on a journey by boat to Ethiopia. When we first meet Taki, he's seen staring intently out from behind prison bars. His location in this space marks his captivity. It also serves to construct our understanding of Babylon in relation to the carceral state. In the opening sequence, a longing for home and departure is also signaled through the refrain that Taki's cellmate sings. Jailhouse set me free, me want go home and me yard. Only moments later, when Taki is told by a police officer that he's free to go, his cellmate further declares, Babylon jailhouse set you free, fly like a bird. Following his release, we see Taki engaging in a series of meetings. And these include a meeting where he acquires large blue water containers, where he inquires about machetes, and another where he talks to a group of men refurbishing a boat. We also see him steal a van with food in collusion with a security guard in a sequence very reminiscent of iconic heist films. It is this heist of the food van that sets the police on Taki's trail and results in a chase sequence that builds to up to the moment of flight and departure of the boat bound for Ethiopia as the men sail out to sea, leaving the police searching for them. The end of the film becomes an escape from Babylon as a location and Babylon as the police. After their departure, the police discover a map. This moment in the film becomes visually overlaid with a previous temporal moment where Taki stands studying the map prior to their departure. Taki's act of leaving the map serves to symbolically render it not as a singular tool of wayfinding, but rather as an itinerary, one of several ways to chart departure. This act of leaving the map behind also serves to link the question of maps and memories in ways that recall the histories and narratives of embodied wayfinding that have circulated and been retold within African diasporic cultures. We are reminded here of Sylvia Wynter's astute reflections on what it means to mistake the map for the territory and how that risks re-imprisoning ourselves in the unbearable wrongness of being. As Kyle Miller writes in his rendering of the dialogue between the Rastaman and the cartographer, throughout time, they have gripped like girdles to make his people smaller than they were, end of quote. So Taki's attempt to flee capture land, and here I'm thinking about maps themselves as capture land, is symbolized by this act of leaving the map behind as they sail out to sea. Yet, if as I argue that leaving the map behind is important, what does it then mean that by the end of the film, it reimposes a map as part of the image that accompanies the closing credits? So the closing sequence of the film is of an animated map that traces the crossing to Ethiopia via the coast of South America. The ragged boat on which they embark on this journey sails different coordinates of the global South. The animated image is for all intents and purposes a postscript to the film. And yet I would argue that its function is significant as it serves to mark a desire to affirmatively realize return, rather than leaving us with the diasporic sense of insecurity or with the question of whether or not they successfully made the journey. The film in this closing gesture seeks to definitively perform a moment of return. In this narrative move, the fact of arrival is rendered more significant than the self-embodied act of leaving Babylon. And this act of mapping also symbolically achieves what we might term, following Dionne Brand, as an arrival at desire. And I want to offer, I want to offer the idea that the film demonstrates a desire to foreclose and perhaps resolve the insecurity of the Black body in diaspora through the security of marking and mapping a moment of return. But at the same time, I also want to suggest that something is imaginatively lost. Something is definitely lost in this return to the tool of cartography as a way of marking their flight. Part 3. A Map to the Door of No Return In A Map to the Door of No Return, Dionne Brand tells a story that was told to her by a friend about the Emancipation Day gathering and celebrations in Kingston in 1998. Quote, "The Prime Minister of Ghana was on a state visit. He was making a speech to a great gathering when a delegation of Rastafarians requesting to speak with him pressed towards the stage. He continued speaking about the wonderful developments in Jamaica, the long way they had come from slavery, etc. The Rastafarians continued their urgings to have a word with him. Security tried to keep them back, but they pressed on towards the stage. Finally, the Prime Minister addressed them again, declaiming his admiration for the country. They, cutting him off, said in exasperation, 'But we want to go home,' home meaning Africa," end of quote. For Brand's part, she writes following this moment in the text. "Home, I was never sure I wanted to go home. I like the streets of the city. I like other people's houses. Too much has been made of origins. All origins are arbitrary. That is to say, they're not also nurturing. That is not to say they're not also nurturing, but they are essentially coercive and indifferent." Following the departure of the occupants of the boat from the shore in Elderkin's film, a lone figure stares at the horizon. He's a Rasta elder, but like Moses, he knows he won't enter the promised land. When the police officers arrive on the beach in search of Taki, he's questioned about their whereabouts. In response to the police officers' questions about where the men have gone, the elder utters a single reply, "Home." His articulation of this word is given the weight of prophetic utterance because of the ending of the film, in which the closing credits literally map the journey to Ethiopia. But at the moment when the man stares at the horizon and utters the word, its ambiguity is resonant. Is he affirming his faith in the possibility and narrative of return? The potential reading of an affirmation of his faith is delicately balanced and measured against the melancholia in his voice. Maybe in this moment, we can also apprehend how insecurity is a structure of feeling that a body can hold and one that a place can hold. Perhaps this is one way in which we might understand the feeling of living on captured land. Dionne Brand talks about this in her discourse on the body that always feels in the middle of a journey, always alert, as well as in her examination of what she calls the virtuosity and despair of diaspora. But as we look out to the horizon with this man, as he said the word home, we also observe the fact that he is in fact staring at the ocean, at the boat treading water. This moment, read differently, acknowledges the multiple possibilities and outcomes of ship voyages for Black peoples of the diaspora. Home might be a location of desire to which they might arrive on the other side of the journey, or a space they might find with the ancestors in the waters of the deep. Thank you.
Grant, can we put the volume on and just watch to the end of the film?
We look back at a place we once called home. Onward to the future.
I bring the brown east. Welcome on a Rasta man. A Rasta no live on no capital. What you mean? Carry we go home. What you mean? As if we settle and cease. Welcome on a Rasta man. A Rasta no live on no capital. Well, Lord America a capital and the whole of Jamaica a capital and a long time them want trick the Rasta man. Like them no know say that man a real African. You think me no member King Ferdinand and thief in Columbus have a golden plan. Them make a wrong turn and end up in Caribbean. Genocide kill enough Indian. And turn paradise in a plantation. And bring cross one ship load of African. Now here comes the thief in Queen from England. Now she Cromwell and Henry Maga. Sent it on top a century full of separation. And after 400 years me send a reparation. I know them want to kill me with the taxation. But I beg you please take me to the motherland. I beg you carry me go home. I bring me from the east. Well, come on a Rasta man. A Rasta no live on no Jachala. Could I never carry me go home? I say please take your land seas. Come on a Rasta man. A Rasta no live on no Jachala.
Thank you so much, Ron, for your beautiful Caribbean relational poetics. I just want to let you know that Dr. Sharon Beckford Foster, who was originally scheduled to be our next speaker, is unable to join us because she's attending to a loss in her family. Marcelle-Anne Fletcher generously agreed to move up from the next panel, and so it's my pleasure to introduce her to you. Marcelle-Anne Fletcher is a PhD student in social and political thought at York University. She holds a Bachelor of Social Sciences in Political Science and Women's Studies and an MA in Littérature et Culture du Monde from University of Ottawa. She's broadly interested in ethical deconstructions, critical formations, and productive refusals of representations of racial slavery's violence and its legacies in the Americas. Marcelle-Anne also works as a research assistant at Institute for Social Research, investigating systemic anti-Black racism in major sectors and institutions of Canadian society. She's one of the primary organizers of this gathering. The title of her offering is Blue Dreams, Black Sleep. Thanks so much, Marcelle-Anne.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, so the title is Blue Dreams, Black Sleep, and I have a couple of epigraphs. It sometimes seems to some of us that we are on the verge of some great getting up in the morning, in which the dead will awaken, the many thousands gone will return, and all will be right as rain and without thunder. We are said to have moved from slavery to segregation to neo-segregation, free at last, or so our masters tell us. But the fire bell is still ringing in the night, somewhere behind the wall of sleep, and all is not as it seems in the promised land of the civil rights movement dream. Before the morning is night, and memory and forgetting will not let us simply declare things to be all right. Anthony Farley. One is not in control in dreams. Dreams take place. The dreamer is captive, even though it is the dreamer who is dreaming. Captured in one's own body, in one's own thoughts, to be out of possession of one's mind, our cognitive schema is captivity. Dionne Brand. Dionne Brand concludes episode 8 of Voyage in Map. Quote, I fall into the deepest of sleeps. I dream, I can't remember what. The next morning I wake up thinking it is still the day before. Then I realize I have missed the whole evening. End quote. In withholding the narrator's emotion and immediately redirecting readers' attention, this evening may appear inconsequential. However, taking these episodes seriously may reveal the ways in which anti-Blackness constitutes and disrupts our understanding of sleep. This paper considers how the narrator's view offers a representation of sleep's anti-Black constitution in terms of its effects: insomnia, nightmares, death-like sleep, psychosis. Intellectual engagement with sleep is difficult to sustain. Plagued by amnesia upon waking, held captive by nightmares and night terrors, seduced by dreams of an alternate world, relegated to the natural and thus taken for granted as an apolitical, trans-historical, and perhaps even universal experience. However, sleep indexes a racist domination and an economic exploitation. Think about the racial sleep gap, sleep deprivation is torture, or disparities in disordered sleeping. Understanding that sleep is indexical of socio-political relations, scholars have explored sleep, or at least a kind of close-eyed pause, particularly in photographs, as a kind of quiet liberation from, or even reparation for, racist myths about the superhuman industry or idleness of Black people. However, opposite to these scholars, I argue that a deep, dreamless sleep, what I am calling Black sleep, could and should be interpreted as, to borrow from Harriet Jacobs, something akin to freedom, where that freedom is neither absolute nor uncomplicated. A sleep becomes like, or rather akin to freedom, insofar as it offers respite or reprieve for Black people from racial enclosure. Dreams, on the other hand, in MAP, as in the world, offer little relief and in fact intensify feelings of captivity and disorientation. MAP makes use of dreams, and by emphasizing the ongoingness of slavery rather than the progressive narrative of freedom, recasts them as macabre, as sites of intimate violation. These two modes of slumber, lurid dreaming and deep dreamlessness, which I refer to as blue dreams and Black sleep respectively, illuminate the incredible effortfulness of sleeping, of dreaming, and of living in an anti-Black world. This kind of blackened knowledge or unscientific method, as Christina Sharp would say, foregrounds Blackness as a place to theorize from. And in doing so, quote, any wisp of a dream becomes evidence, end quote. Brand maintains that a technological colonialism in the form of radio broadcasts occupied the consciousness of Caribbeans. She writes, quote, through the BBC broadcasts, we were inhabited by British consciousness. We were also inhabited by an unknown self, the African. This duality was fought every day from the time one woke up to the time one fell asleep. Even our dreams were not free of this conflict, end quote. The emphasis on the full extent of that statement, even our dreams were not free, presupposes that sleep and dreams make repose possible. Investment in the trope of freedom dreams is undercut by Brand, both implicitly and explicitly, exposing the paradoxes of these dreams, sustained by a captive consciousness and animated as they are by the nightmare of racial slavery. Brand recalls, quote, I would wake up on the point of asphyxiation, end quote, and here I pause to contend with how dreaming violently holds Brand, how the certainty of Black aspiration is not assured even in and as she sleeps, how sleep becomes a vehicle for taking breath from the body. She continues, quote, much later, my lover had a dream of being cuffed at the ankles. I, watching her sleep, did not know her distress, only lay watching, deciding whether to wake her or let her finish her nightmare. She kicked violently, trying to free herself, cutting my ankle with her toes and waking to my soothing her. Then I remembered my dreams of the Sargasso, its thick tangle of bones long turned to coral and sand, end quote. The nightmarish quality of captivity and Brand's hesitation to wake her lover begs the question, what is worse, waking or sleeping in, to, through captivity? How could Brand show care for her lover in this context? Whether waking or sleeping, quote, existence in the diaspora is like that, dreams from which one never wakes, end quote. Indeed, one cannot dream their way out of the ongoingness of slavery, nor can they wake up from the nightmarish, quote, persistence of the specter of captivity, end quote. This is the effortfulness of sleeping and waking in an anti-Black world. Brand's journey to Sydney, Australia is an uncomfortable one, described as claustrophobic and lengthy under the pack-in-'em-tight design of the aircraft. Is it any wonder that she rarely sleeps on planes? It seems that even in flight, her body is somehow gesturing towards this door, gesturing toward the unmaking of subjects into human cargo. As Hortense Spillers writes, this unmaking is made possible through the literal suspension of enslaved men and women in the oceanic, in which subjects are taken into account as quantities. If the cognitive schema is captivity, one could say Brand's literal suspension in the capital O oceanic, taken into account as quantity for economy seating on this plane, is refracted through the quote, slave ship's profitability, further elucidating the perverse dialectic between capital accumulation and restrictions on sleep, end quote. If we return to Voyage, Brand's flight to Africa is nerve-wracking. Unable to sleep, eyes burning, legs cramped, stomach in knots, strangers next to her asleep, I wonder, what is prompting this restless, vertiginous 24-hour waking sleep? In Brand's narrative, it is Africa, or the idea of Africa. She wants to feel it, not post-apartheid Johannesburg, where she will land and stay. Africa is a romanticized origin story, the origin story, so it precedes and exceeds relationships, imagined or otherwise, to Blackness. The lidless, open-eyed sleep and yearning to feel Africa leads to the following scene in Brand's hotel. Quote, "The dead weight of my body hits the small bed. It is afternoon in Johannesburg. The opening of the new Nation Writers Conference will be later that night. Nelson Mandela will be there. It will be a grand welcome and celebration. I fall into the deepest of sleeps. I, usually so insomniac, so fitful, sleep as if forever. I dream, I can't remember what. The next morning I wake up thinking it is still the day before, then realized I have missed the whole evening," end quote. The conference's significance should not be understated. It tarried an attempt at cultural reconstruction as apartheid disappeared from public view. And the symbolism of civil rights activist and father of the nation, Nelson Mandela, as a figurehead in that reconstruction and the freedom of renewal. So what do we make of the narrator dead asleep during this event? I think about Christina Sharp's call to stay in the wake and perform wake work, for depicting aesthetically the impossibility of resolutions offered by civil and human rights, by representing the paradoxes of Blackness within and after the legacies of slavery's denial of Black humanity. This deep dreamless sleep, untethered from freedom dreams, functions as a psychic retreat from the racial enclosures of the post-civil rights era. Brand does not attend the conference, but neither does she reveal an imagined dreamful otherwise. This is not opacity or fugitive illegibility. Available grammars of resistance fail to name this reprieve. In episode 2 of October, Blackness, but particularly Black sleep, is always out of sync with time. Brand begins, quote, "I was in Grenada. There was a coup on the 19th of October, a state of emergency. 4 days later, the Americans invaded the island. On the day of the coup, I was sleeping late. I had been ill. I would usually be at work by 9 a.m., end quote. Sleeping late, late being an indication that Brand is offbeat, not, quote, following the rhythms of moneyed time in which night means time for sleep, end quote. As the day progressed, she admits every minute was a surprise. In her dreams, she and the intuitive woman from Carriacou are killed. And she confesses, quote, "When I awoke from these dreams, I was not certain which was the dream and which was the real day," end quote. Although the narrator's uncertainty and feverish haze, which seemed to last for years, might suggest a break with reality, because of Brand's elaboration of the constitutive function of anti-Blackness within the real world and the dream world, this break marks an increased attunement to the anti-Black registers of reality in a post-independence era. Anti-Blackness, Calvin Warren argues, quote, "is situated on both ends of the dream work, as that which puts pressure on the dream and on the world. In a catachristic fantasy, a free Black is a fantasy within the real world and within the unconscious dream. Neither the real world nor the unconscious can adequately represent this thing. Condensation and displacement are left without any sign except a nonsense one. In other words, the catachrestic fantasy dissolves the distinction between the real and the fantasy, not just because anti-Blackness is found on both sides, but also because the free Black doesn't exist on either side, end quote. Unable to make sense of her dreams and the nonsense of reality that follows, she confesses, "It was all I could do to hold on to my mind, that is, to know the orderly passing of minutes and the idea that the sun comes up and it's daylight, it goes down and night comes." If the door of no return is consciousness, it follows that anti-Blackness constitutes consciousness itself. And if living at the door of no return is to live self-consciously, exist doubly, and have others constantly remark on your presence as outside of itself, then perhaps you can only experience relief from the door when you act unself-consciously. Sleep is a state in which consciousness can be suspended, allowing the body to recuperate from waking life. In effect, suspending attachment in or to the world. Such a capacity opens up a space that is no space, not for an imagined otherwise, but an escape from the phenomenological structure of captivity itself, a life without plot, a night without narrative. Of course, there is no true suspension of attachment to an anti-Black world, even in sleep, but a deep, dreamless slumber, what I am calling Black sleep, offers a moment of forgetfulness, what Brand might call the gift of forgetting. In the final pages, Map reflects on the kind of non-inheritance passed over generations. Quote, "It was a gift, forgetting, the only gift that one, the one bending reluctantly toward the opening of the door of no return, could give," end quote. In this passage, forgetting is a kind of memory work, a way of staying in the wake by refusing to lose hold of the rupture, the crack in the world that always already precedes our arrival into being. Forgetting is generative, not in its ability to prompt us to an elsewhere or an elsewhen, but in its capacity to upend the psychic scaffolding upon which the nightmare of consciousness, both dreaming and waking, holds us. Perhaps this forgetting constitutes the end of racial enclosure, the end of the color line, the end of plot, of narrative, the end of the world as we know it. And if so, maybe facing the abyssal is just another name for wayfinding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcelle-Anne, for that meditation on sleep, dream, and memory work. So beautiful. I'm about to introduce our last panelist, but before I do so, just want to invite and encourage you to post any questions you have related to the conversation today using the Q&A function in Zoom. Bedour Alagraa is Assistant Professor of Political and Social Thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She received her PhD from the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University in the spring of 2019 and was an Andrew W. Mellon Graduate Fellow during her time at Brown. Her book manuscript is entitled The Interminable Catastrophe, Fatal Liberalisms, Plantation Logics, and Black Political Life in the Wake of Disaster. It charts a conceptual history of catastrophe as a political category or concept rather than event via its inauguration in early modern natural science and empiricist debates and subsequent crystallization as a concept on the plantation. The title of her offering is Splinters and Fragments, Looking Through a Map, Finding Wonder. Welcome, Alagraa.
Hi,
Sorry,
everyone.
Bedour, Dr. Alagraa.
You can call me whatever you'd like to. Thank you for having me, and I'm so sad that I can't be back home in Toronto with all of you sharing in this moment. I am going to just dive in and offer my reflection called Splinters and Fragments, Looking into a Map, Finding Wonder. I remember the first time I read Map to the Door of No Return like it was yesterday. I was a student at the University of Toronto studying political theory. I was writing a paper for my Cold War history class and decided to write about the map that was used on the syllabus, which showed the countries of the world split in two by the Iron Curtain. I actually found the physical paper I wrote, and this is what my 20-year-old self wrote back in 2009, and this is a direct quote. Quote, essentially, this map is not an empirical source. It is simply a representation of the narrative of the map maker or cartographer. In fact, all maps are stories told by the cartographers of what we call the modern world. The shrinking of the size of Africa on most standard maps, charts measuring constellations in space, these are all our impositions onto the world around us. Drawing maps, as was done during the so-called Cold War, is a fundamental part of staking claims to power. This is something I have only come to appreciate recently after reading poet Dionne Brand's Map to the Door of No Return. She writes, quoting David Turnbull, that, quote, in order to find our way successfully, we need a cognitive schema as well as practical mastery of wayfinding, end quote. She then asks, what if the cognitive schema is captivity? What Brand has revealed to me is that a map not only reflects, but imposes a cognitive schema of the world. In the case of this Cold War map, the cognitive schema is denial of the way most of the world was not cold during this period, but in fact in flames, and denial of the multitude of people who rejected the bifurcated construction of world politics, end quote. It's not too bad, I think, for, like a second-year paper. I was sure this essay would get me into deep trouble. The professor was handing back papers and asked if I would stay back to speak with him. I was sure this was the moment I was going to be reprimanded. The professor, who was an adjunct, then proceeded to tell me that he was from the former Yugoslavia, had arrived in Canada just a few years ago, and that he too hated the map he was forced to use to teach the course, but he had no power over the design of the syllabus. He said he wanted to thank me for writing the paper and to thank me even more for introducing him to the work of Dionne Brand, who he said was the most beautiful writer he had ever encountered. I will never forget this moment. It showed me that even in the place one might least expect, Dionne Brand's work offers an opening. In fact, wherever her work lands, in my estimation, there is a possible opening. I share this anecdote to show how Brand's work has held me and my thinking together over the last 11 years. Truly, this book taught me to read, as though for the first time. Everything I read after that, Brand's Map to the Door of No Return, was a hidden transcript, the baseline. It was the blue note, years before I ever read The Blue Clerk, a secret between me and whatever text I was reading. Part 1, Splinters and Fragments. Dionne Brand tells us, quote, too much has been made of origins. If I reject origins, I have also to reject its mirror, end quote. I read this line on a news ticker-like display in my head when I read Walcott when he says, quote, we make too much of that long groan which underlines the past, end quote. When he says that, quote, I have no father, I want no such father, although I can understand you, black ghost, white ghost, when you both whisper history, since your features are anonymous and erased, and I have no wish and no power to pardon, end quote. Again, if I reject origins, I have also to reject his mirror. It plays in my head, a bridge when Césaire proclaims, quote, I search in vain for the place where I ever preached a return of any kind, where I ever claimed that there could be a return, end quote. Brand's words tell me to look closer and read carefully when Walt Whitman writes, quote, I have heard what the talkers are talking, the talk of the beginning and the end, but I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, end quote. Sylvia Wynter responds. She tells me that origins are in fact fictions, but the stories associated with them matter to us as Black people. We are always writing and unwriting them. What bigger break is there than telling different stories about how we came to arrive in this condition, in this place? Invention into existence. Brand offers the call once again, quote, nation states are configurations of origins as exclusionary power structures which have legitimacy based solely on conquest and acquisition, end quote. I'm now reading Darkwater for a class. Suddenly Du Bois' words join the chorus, quote, What is whiteness that one should so desire it? I'm given to understand that whiteness is ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen, end quote. Brand's refusal of the nation state sounds an alarm in my head when I read Jamaica Kincaid for the first time, where she writes, quote, what makes the world turn? Who would need an answer to such a question? And what do I ask? What is the question I can ask? I ask, what makes the world turn against me? End quote. This call and response between these poets and writers of the Americas reverberates back and forth in my mind. Brand calls out again, quote, Black experience in any modern city or town in the Americas is a haunting. One enters a room and history follows. One enters a room and history proceeds. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives. Where one stands in a society seems always related to this historical experience. Where one can be observed is relative to that history. All human effort seems to emanate from this door. How do I know this? Only by self-observation, only by looking, only by feeling, only by being a part, sitting in the room with history. In my mind, the call and response intensifies. Derek Walcott calls back, quote, the fate of poetry is to fall in love with the world in spite of history. There's no better way to describe what Brand's poetry offers us. This book is something to behold, something to cherish, and something to love in spite of history. Part 2, looking through a map. The bridge repeats. Brand's pen is now singing or crying to me. Sometimes I can't tell the difference. And it says, quote, to live in the Black diaspora is, I think, to live as a fiction, a creation of empires, and also self-creation. It is to be a being living inside and outside of herself. It is to apprehend the sign one makes, yet to be unable to escape it, except in radiant moments of ordinariness made like art. To be a fiction in search of its most resonant metaphor, then, is even more intriguing. So I am scouring maps of all kinds the way that some fictions do, discursively, elliptically, trying to locate their own transferred selves, end quote. This is the baseline that keeps the tempo as I continue to read. Brand has broken the pentameter. I read for the first time Kemal Brathwaite's poem, Islands, in 2016, and all the blood rushes to my head. Brathwaite and Brand are, in my head, seated across from one another, talking with their hands. I'm exhilarated at the display. The baseline intensifies, the bridge which repeats only by sitting in the room with history. Now, Kemal's words are the top note. He says, quoting from his poem, quote, looking through a map of the Antilles, you see how time has trapped its humble servants here. Descendants of the slave do not lie in the lap of the more fortunate gods. The rat in the warehouse is as much king as the sugar he plunders. Looking through a map of the islands, you see that history teaches that when hope splinters, when the pieces of broken glass lie in the sunlight, then the rope will never unravel its knots. The branding iron's traveling flame that teaches us pain will never be extinguished. The island's jewels, Saba, Barbuda, dry flattened Antigua, will remain rocks, dots in the sky blue frame of the map, end quote. And then they talk of water, which cradles the baseline and the top note. Oh, what would a map be without its container, that blue base that holds together the frame? Brand offers us the call once again. Water is another country. Walcott says, oh yes, the sea is history. Somewhere, Clyde Woods reminds us, quote, nobody knows the mysteries at the bottom of the ocean, end quote. He then breaks out into a song. It's a hymn for the submerged lower Ninth Ward, and he sings, do you know what it means to miss New Orleans? Walcott raises his finger and quotes from Omeros, quote, a man who cursed the sea has cursed his own mother. They're all a symphony, a beautiful counterpoint in my mind, this incredible melodrama staged in my imagination, pulled together by a powerful invitation, Dionne Brand's Map to the Door of No Return. The year is 2014. I'm reading Sylvia Winters on how we mistook the map for the territory for the first time. I'm dizzy from being pushed off of my cognitive and epistemological center. She writes, quote, the emergence of the Black Studies movement in its original thrust, before its later co-optation into the mainstream of the very order of knowledge whose truth in some abstract universal sense it had arisen to contest, was inseparable from the parallel emergence of the Black aesthetic, Black arts movements, and the central reinforcing relationship that had come to exist between them. Once established, these new programs and departments functioned to enable some of the major figures of the then far more powerful and dynamic Black arts, Black aesthetic movements to carry some of their work into the academic mainstream, even where they too, like Black studies as a whole itself, were to find their original transgressive intentions diffused. This emancipation had been effected at the level of the map rather than at the level of the territory. She does not miss words. Black studies has been defanged, yes, by institutionalization, but also by giving in to the seduction of discipline, the disciplinary provincializing of the initial third world gaze. I recall Brand's question, quote, "What if the cognitive schema is captivity?" Brand's text held my hand through the difficult journey through Winter's crucial message. A discipline is a map and its cognitive schema is captivity. It did not take me a second or third read to understand the stakes of Winter's proclamation that we must embrace sociogeny and unburden ourselves of discipline. I thank Brand once again for preparing me to accept this charge. Part 3, Dreams, Wonder. Brand calls out to me once again, quote, "This door is really the door of dreams. This existence in the diaspora is like that, dreams from which one never wakes. Then what here can be called cognition, let alone a schema, a set of dreams, a strand of stories which never come into being, which never coalesce? One is not in control in dreams. Dreams take place. The dreamer is captive. Even though it is the dreamer who is dreaming, captured in one's own body, in one's own thoughts, to be out of possession of one's struggles for human right, of one's mind. Our cognitive schema is captivity. But what of all rebellions, emancipations, political struggles for human rights? Aren't these part of the schema too? Yes, except for the perpetual retreats and recoveries. In the diaspora, as in bad dreams, you are constantly overwhelmed by the persistence of the specter of captivity, the door of dreams," end quote. The year is 2017. I'm reading Brand's ossuaries for the first time. The opening words are, to date, one of the most remarkable openings to any text I've ever read. Quote, "I lived and loved," some might say, "in momentous times. Looking back, my dreams were full of prisons," end quote. I recall, quote, "The dreamer is captive, captured in one's own bodies and one's own thoughts," end quote. My heart is racing. 2017 is also the year I first read Derek Walcott's play, Dream on Monkey Mountain. I gasp when I read the following passage from the stage notes, knowing that I could not have read it without Brand's baseline. It reads, quote, "The play is a dream, one that exists not even so much in the given minds of its principal characters as in that of its writer, and as such, it is illogical, derivative, contradictory," end quote. In the play, the main character is in jail. He's a captive who every night dreams of freedom in Africa. His dreams intensify, his dreams become more feverish. He eventually reaches Africa, only for his captivity to find him there. He realizes he was born of this captivity. He awakens from the dream and returns home to Monkey Mountain. Return is not possible. Quote, "The door is really the door of dreams," end quote. Brand shows me that a return to Africa is not repair, but it is a break. How we inhabit that break is our creative task. In Dream on Monkey Mountain, his return to Africa allowed the main character to finally enact a break, to part with this Africa that simply no longer exists. Fanon instructs us to break with Europe and man by telling us to leap. Brand shows us that return is also a break. And yet, Brand reminds us that even if return is an impossibility, there's wonder in the attempt, in attempting to make our way. She writes upon visiting Soufrière that, quote, "The volcano last erupted in the 1980s, yet there is a small village here, defying the earth yellow and reddish," end quote. She continues, taking my breath away, quote, "Desire too is the discovery of beauty as miraculous, desire in the face of ruin. For some, to find beauty is to search through ruins," end quote. I hold out this page of her poem as I read Patrick Chamoiseau's Texaco for the first time. In my mind, he sighs, quoting from his novel, quote, "A wretched life bloomed above the disaster," end quote. Derek Walcott joins the symphony once again and says that this sifting through ruination is the task of the poet, even if what they might assemble is oftentimes both beautiful and grotesque. He writes, quote, "And this is the exact process of making poetry, or what should be called not its making, but its remaking, the fragmented memory, the armature that frames the God, even the right that surrenders it to a final pyre, the God assembled cane by cane, reed by weaving reed, line by plaited line, as the artisans of felicity would erect his holy echo," end quote. He then offers a coup de grace, quote, "Exiled from your own Edens, you have placed me in the wonder of another," end quote. Dionne Brand's Map to the Door of Return taught me to read and to stage these readings between archipelagic thinking and writing. My mind is a constellation of conversations, a solar system between Brathwaite, Winter, Césaire, Walcott, and so many others. And the Map to the Door of No Return is the sun. It taught me that reading is above all else a practice of finding your way, not just in what the author has offered, but as a cognitive schema that exceeds the one offered by any map. In doing so, the Map to the Door of No Return placed me in the wonder of another. There's no ocean big enough to hold my gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Bedour, for that refusal again of disciplines and colonial logics, and that exercise in reading patiently and thoughtfully. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite all the panelists to join me. I don't think that when we put this panel together, we had any sense of just how powerfully all of your offerings would cohere. Can you put on your videos and join me, please? Thank you. Thank you so much. Once again, I'm inviting the audience to send us some questions. There have been shout outs from them about how wonderful your papers have been. While they gather their thoughts, because I know this has been really, really rich, I'd like to maybe offer a preliminary question, and you can do with it whatever you will, each of you. So I am struck by the rich intertextuality and multimodality of each of your offerings, in which you are drawing variously on music, poetry, film, storytelling, and dream work as disruptive analytics that contest both colonial logics of cartography and the logic of the white settler nation and its terms of belonging. I'm wondering if each of you can talk a little bit more, beyond your 15 minutes that you were assigned, about why it was necessary for you as scholars in different fields to turn to these forms in your reflection of map. If cartography, as Josh says, is always about control and power, how do these forms make it possible for you to theorize in ways that elude violence and control, including the violence of the academy? Josh, do you want to go first?
I can try. They were the forms that taught me how to be different. And it's only later that I understood that that difference was created out of this desire to not be the norm and to refuse the norm. But growing up, in the settings that these forms, like the blues and gospel and jazz and dance, in the settings that we practice them, I didn't necessarily recognize it as a political or a anti-colonial form. It was just who we were. And so being in the academy where those forms are either rendered as something that we can observe from distance and then come up with a sort of lens for telling us what they mean, and me reading that and then knowing them, it's like, wait a minute, that ain't what we was doing. And reading people like Brand, and I see the life of the people, and it was so recognizable, and I could only relate it to what I knew as life growing up and being in community with people. And so that's how I got there.
Thank you so much. Any of our other panelists?
If I may, part of that practice is also just taking cues from map as a text, right? The ways in which it moves or brings together in conversation disparate texts. I often think of the way in which within the study of literature, As a discipline, we often approach the study of literatures through national boundaries. And I think there's something that A Map to the Door as a text does that undoes that. Bringing Coetzee and Morrison into conversation, right? Into proximity to each other. And I think there's something really powerful and instructive about that. I read MAP as a kind of methodology for doing a kind of decolonial thinking that is not only attuned to that question of borders, but as Bedour pointed out, but also disciplines, right? And asking us to think in a much more expansive way about relation and to problematize belonging.
Thank you so much. As a literary scholar, I relate to MAP in exactly the same way. So thank you, Ron. Bedour, go ahead.
Yeah. So, my background is in, political theory. I'm still accepting condolences from everybody. It's not all bad. And I still kind of am very much in that kind of space conceptually. But what I think is, for me, I've always loved long poems. All of my favorite poets have written just beautiful long poems, right? Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, Map to the Door of No Return, Omeros, Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Walt Whitman's like one of my favorite American poets, right? And there's something about the way that the long poem, it just is so decadent. There's something wonderful about taking your time to do something, right? And kind of meandering and not necessarily finding your way right away, right? And I think that Brand's text, I think, is probably the highest articulation of that form that I've seen, right? Because of the way that it is, it's not memoir. It's also a long poem. It's also kind of dotted with archival, right? Incantations, right? It is like Derek Walcott has this beautiful line. He says, refusing poetry and becoming a poem, right? So you have to actually, right, just concede the form, right? The form itself will never be captured totally, right? But you have to inhabit all that which exceeds the form, all that which the form actually can't hold. And that's actually what we're reaching for, right? It's everything that exceeds the frame, right? Which is why Maps to the Door of No Return has given me so much, because it actually tells you, right, that thinking through a discipline, thinking through a concept is just an enclosure, right? What we're actually looking for is outside of that frame. And that's what the Map to the Door of No Return taught me. And that's why I've been able to be more creative, even in my thinking as a quote unquote political theorist, because I know, right, that once you enclose something, you can actually move on and think about everything else, right? And I think that's what this text has definitely offered me.
Thank you. Marcelle-Anne?
Yeah, I think Bedour said that so eloquently. I think if there was anything I could add, what I appreciate about MAP, and Brand says this directly, is that, books are not necessarily about uplifting people's spirits. And I think in certain academic disciplines, there is an expectation that we're going to kind of do that effective work. And so I like this idea of being more pensive and exploring that kind of, unpleasant affect. And I guess the other thing I really appreciate about MAP, she's constantly meditating on the tensions between, the works of those famous cartographers and travelers, and then our, 20th century writers. So I don't know, I guess that also just expands my thinking.
Thank you so much. We now have a few questions, and in the interest of time, I am going to try as equitably as I can to disperse a question each to you so that each of you can answer one of them. And at the end, to wrap up, I'm going to ask each of you just very, very briefly if you would like to comment on each other's work. So let's start with the first question from Ryan Johnson. This may be, let's see who would like to take this question. And you can follow along in the Q&A because it's kind of long. Ryan says, I would love to hear if the panelists see Marcus Garvey in MAP. Professor Cummings' moving presentation focusing on the animated map at the end of the film made me think of Garvey. Then Marcelle-Anne Fletcher's incredible insights about the weight of an idea, the idea of Africa, made me wonder how Garveyism might inform MAP. And if so, how does Brand critique, elaborate, or move beyond Garvey? Perhaps my point is to think about how Brand thinks of time and the door. Maps are obviously spatial, but what is the chronology of the door of no return? I am so grateful for all the presenters and their powerful insights. Let me just move to a second question. This one is for you, Bedour. Your words catch the whiffs of the poetic maps that extend past the pentameter, which you've already noted. In that light, the question of mappings and returns capture me. But Brandon Winter caused me to pause and reorient. So I ask, when we imagine other cognitive schemas, other referent West, where do we sit? Can we sit, or shall we, as Professor Rinaldo Walcott notes, move in the name of our inventive existence? So I will give that one to you, Bedour. Just one more from Keguro Macharya. Thank you for all these mind-blowing offerings. We are truly honored to witness and engage them. All the presentations engage music in some way, the blues, reggae, jazz, classical. I wonder if you'd each muse a little about music works as method and guide to read and think with MAP. I think Josh addressed this a little bit. I don't know if you want to do a bit more. And one final one, Marcelle-Anne. I have, what did I do? I'm not sure. Here it is. I have conceptualized dreaming as a form and also function of decolonialism, a creativity, futurism. I'm interested in your thoughts of dreaming as captivity. I would like to hear more of this thinking. So may I ask each of you to grab one of those?
I'll go first. I actually have brief comments on the Garvey question because I also think it relates to some of the work Sylvia Wynter has done in Black Metamorphosis and the importance of the Garveyite movement. And I think that Garvey and Brand are not actually in opposite ideological opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, right? Because what Garvey showed us, the intervention he made is that we're actually from Africa, right? So that, because I don't think people recognize the impact at the time, right? People were not calling themselves Africans. They were not referring to themselves as displaced Africans. So what Garvey did was he clarified, right, that Black people in the Americas are actually displaced Africans. Now, he wasn't appealing to some interior purity of Africa that we know doesn't exist, right? He was actually appealing to the conditions of Africa as they were at the time. He was in conversation with Africans in Africa, in Europe, and all over the world, right? So his was not a romanticized view, right? It might have been kind of overdetermined in its pragmatism, actually, rather than romanticism, because his view was, his way of doing things was very instrumental, right? But I don't think they're on opposite ends ideologically, because Garvey is not telling us that Africa is the solution. He's telling us Africa is for the Africans and Europe is for the Europeans, which is something different from saying, right, that Africa is the silver bullet to all of our issues. And I think that the number of Garveyite chapters that emerged across the world, the biggest chapter was in New Orleans, right? It wasn't in Africa, it wasn't in Europe, it wasn't, and so we don't actually have to lose one or the other. But the importance of Garvey, as Wynter notes, right, is that he was giving us a different origin story, right? Not over-determining the origin itself, but giving us a different story about how we got here, right? And again, these things are not separate. And then on the question of where do we sit, I think, where do we, when we imagine other cognitive schemas, where do we sit, can we sit? So part of what's interesting, right, is that I don't think we actually have to do a lot of imagining or stretching our imaginations to think of other cognitive schemas and referent we's. They already exist, right, as Ronald's paper shows, right? kind of Rastafari sociality, the thing is, right, that because of the way Western episteme works, right, the kind of liminal category, as Winter tells us, right, is not actually the in-between thing. It's that thing which must be disavowed in order for what we understand as the script to cohere, right? And so just because it's been disavowed and we don't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there, right? So I think there is like an implicit assumption even in the question, right, that we actually have to like do new work to find those things. We actually have to undo what she calls the narrative condemnation, which is required disavowal in order for our understanding to cohere. So then what we have to do actually is Winter provides us two things, right? She gives us the return and the leap at the same time, right? Because she tells us, look at what Junkanoo teaches us, look at what Garvey taught us. And she also tells us we have to assassinate man and make this leap, as Fanon tells us, at the same time, right? She's like a hinge point, right? And so when we say, where do we sit? Can we sit? We are already here in relation. That relation isn't always good, but we're already sitting. And the question is now, how are we going to live together on this planet, right? I think that's would be my answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the technicians and the audience just to indulge me to maybe go 5 minutes over so I can give each panelist a chance to respond. Ronald, go ahead.
Maybe taking up the Garvey question and maybe coming to it in a kind of roundabout way, or through returning to the texts that I'm sitting with. I mean, one of the things that A Map to the Door of No Return does is that there's this long temporal thinking that the text offers us. You know, so the question of return isn't framed purely in a contemporary way, right? There's this longer history, and also a kind of series of return as a series of, maybe we can call them attempts. And one of the things like one moment in Bedour's paper really resonated with me. She said, even if return is an impossibility, there's wonder in the attempt. And I think that's one of the things that also drew me to this film. And there's a kind of way in which, on one hand, I want to resist that map at the end of the film, which plots this return in a sort of linear way, right? And to think about, kind of the open possibilities, which include possibilities of failure, which includes deferral, which includes reroutings, as part of, thinking about Black diaspora making. And rather than thinking about the end of the film, in a kind of way, I perhaps want to think about the opening of the film. So the film begins with this figure behind bars, and he's staring out. And we don't immediately see what he's staring at, but he's staring at a painting that's opposite the bars. And it's a painting of men on a boat on the water. And for me, that's, that encodes a kind of history that's there, right? That, that this attempt isn't the first, right? And I think that's kind of how I think about Garvey within a kind of diasporic consciousness, right? That there's something that Garvey offers as a kind of schema, as a kind of potential, that we're left in its wake to think with and to think about.
Thank you so much. Josh?
Yeah, I can take Kaguru's question, and I'm not an ethnomusicologist, no shade to them, but I don't look at music in that light. I write reviews, but I'm not a critic. I don't see myself as a critic. So for me, I think Dionne Brand, she has a way of bending language that makes me feel the same way that musicians make me feel when they're bending notes. And so what I wanted to do is try to capture some of that.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. Marcelle-Anne?
Sure. I just wanted to, clarify. I wasn't saying that it's, just dreaming that is captivity, but like also waking is part of that too. But for me, reading Map, I just see so often how these dreams are undergirded by like the trope of freedom dreams, and how these dreams reflect like an injury or a conflict. And so often this dreaming is about a way to, like, as Anthony Farley has said, balance a crisis of the modern. And so that's something to think about. So I propose this suspension of attachment just as a way to forget, or like as a retreat into the unconscious.
Thank you so much. And just to close, Christina has asked very briefly if you might want to speak to each other's work, and then I will close. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed all the papers on this panel, and just the ways in which some of the things I was grappling with and thinking about as I was writing this paper were also some of the questions and some of the passages, right, that you all were thinking about. And I think that's also been like one of the great things about this gathering, the ways in which people return to passages from MAP in different ways. You know, asking different questions of different moments of the text. So I really, really appreciated that. I mean, perhaps to also just pick up on sort of Josh's thinking about the blues. One of the things I would say is that I often think of jazz and the blues when I read Dionne. You know, like there are all these notes from Coltrane that are part of Dionne's verse. And I think, you know, part of the question is how do we also learn to hear those, to listen to those, to sit with those as we read the work. Yeah, and you know, I really appreciated Marcelle-Anne's sort of thinking about this question of dreaming and waking, because like I've been grappling with that passage, that line that I talk about very early in my paper, that, you know, this body in diaspora does not doze off easy, right? And I really appreciated your thinking through some of those, you know, thinking through that question in your paper.
Thank you so much. Maybe just one other response. I'm sorry, I asked for 5 minutes and I've swallowed them all out. This has just been so generative. Josh, go ahead.
In 30 seconds, I mean, it's actually interesting to me how this energy sort of emerged on this panel without any of us seeing each other's papers. And I think that says something about the profundity of what is happening in MAP.
Yes, thank you so much. My thanks to all of you for a rich and generative conversation. I was full when we started, and now I am really overflowing. I just want to say thank you also for those of you, almost 200 of you at one point joining us on Zoom, and those of you who are following us on live stream. Please return if you can to the second panel today at 2:30 p.m. with Warren Critchlow, Biko Mandela-Gray, Elisa Trotz, and John Moore, moderated by Ronaldo Walcott. Be well, stay safe, and yeah, rest in these words. They will hold you for a long time. Thank you so much. Thank you.